Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be doing a case analysis of Abuela Alma and her granddaughter Mirabel. Abuela is Spanish for grandmother. So we're looking at this first slide with the word encanto on it, which, if you think of the word enchanting or charming, you're on the right track. It is a Spanish word to mean charm, which is really befitting of today's case as well. I wanted to add that in there as a little extra insight as well as kind of like entertaining. So sometimes on the surface, things aren't what they seem. And with this relationship, there's like a lot of tumultuous atmosphere and communication, which leads to inadequacy feelings, intergenerational trauma, and overall lack of that differentiation of self, which kind of foreshadows the theory and model we'll be applying. So, looking at this table of contents, we're going to iterate the family's challenges, overall diagnostic impressions, what brought them into therapy, the techniques of therapy and theories, treatment plan with SMART goals and objectives, and lastly, interventions and evaluation of everything. So, upon a home visit and further assessment of this family, and particularly these two, Alma and Mirabel, who are both different in age and also generational gaps. Other family members have expressed how Mirabel is very anxious and she's holding up in her room. She's avoiding any thoughts and feelings, for that matter. And this was more evident in session with the two, where Mirabel was very flat and blunted in her affect, and the grandmother was very angry and expressed this by having to be in therapy. So, overall, to encapsulate the situation, Mirabelle and Alma have their share of misunderstandings, which they're not on the same page, so to speak. This has led to that buildup, that resentment, the frustrations, internalization, things like that, and just really created the hostile environment in the family and throughout. Also, reverting to this previous slide, I want to note about the cultural element at play. So that could be collectivism, as the family is Spanish. And so what happens in that family with collectivist culture, it stays in the family, so they're not as comfortable seeking out help. And so I still wanted to honor that concept through validation of saying, how brave they are for coming to therapy and what they think they're in therapy for, as well as what do they think would get them out of therapy quicker, since both of them seemed like they didn't want to be there. So going further into Alma's history a little bit, so she obviously struggles with symptoms related to PTSD, though this is not a formal diagnosis, rather an impression of the signs and symptoms. So she has those symptoms with negative thoughts and feelings, hyperarousal, intense emotions, etc. She also has the compounded trauma of war and violence, as well as refuge and loss of her spouse, which impacts her role within herself and the family. So, to that effect, as the matriarch, which is the considered authority in Spanish culture, she's still a mother to these triplets that are all 50 years old, which is Julieta, Peppa, and Bruno. She has a disparity with Juliet's children, specifically Isabella, the oldest, at 22. She's revered as the golden child, whereas Luisa is still seen as the second oldest, but strong and capable. And lastly, and dead last is Mirabel, within like her age range as well as her position and how she's considered with Boila. So she's kind of deemed like the insolent child. And this also parallels to Mirabel's uncle, Bruno, who has been off the grid for the continuous poor treatment, as he, like Mirabel, tried to keep the peace, but also speak up about issues. So otherwise, Alma has positive interactions with others. So this next slide just goes into more specific symptoms and signs of the possible PTSD diagnosis and really just how long it's been going on. So this is a history of Mirabel, both the middle child and imposter syndrome we see here is a psychological phenomena, so not diagnosed, but a psychological thing dictated by her being overlooked by the grandmother and also like measuring her intrinsic value based on how much she can help others and also sacrificing those needs of herself and losing that autonomy. She's also been previously diagnosed with bipolar 1, although she shows more signs towards generalized anxiety disorder and depression, which this slide goes into more of that in detail. So onward to this genogram, which really is characteristic of the family and the madrigals and the generations to follow. So at the top, we have Pedro and Alma, the grandparents, and then their children and the children's children, which is the grandchildren. And we see an array of differing roles and how they vary. There's also arguable multi-generational transmission with trauma, given how Abuela's history is and how the emotions, patterns, and behaviors are shared. Also, enmeshment is a factor with Mirabel being the therapist role and the caring type and lacking, again, the autonomy and her boundaries as well, which is why the critical paradigm is paradigm to be used here. It applies to that paradigm shift of femininity, which says that you can be both weak and strong for Lisa's case and clean and messy for Isabella's. It also reinforces that intricacy of identity and fluidity through a critical paradigm lens as well. The intergenerational trauma that Abuela has in a political context is true here with the fear of displacement, hence why she stressed her image in the community. And also, this has intersections of race and gender given the collective trauma, the war, and concern over re experiencing, leading back to that possible diagnosis of PTSD. And lastly, it's about the oppressive communication style. So, with her being the highly regarded head of household, so she, for instance, doesn't like anyone to speak during dinner time other than her, and her interactions with Mirabel are built on gaslighting, shaming, guilting, calling her actions out of control. So as we're moving into theory and model, two theories really applied here, Bowen family systems theory and psychodynamic theory. So for Bowen family systems theory, the triangulation piece is formed with Alma placing Isabel on a pedestal, with the adverse being Mirabel on a scapegoat. And then this extrapolates more on the rift between Isabella and Mirabel by having that resentment come out when Mirabel notices the difference in treatment. Another triangle, too, is obviously Mirabel and Dolores. Dolores is Mirabel's cousin. They both feel like they're incomparable to Isabella's beauty and those standards in the family and community. And Dolores digresses this further to Mirabel through venting. So for the emotional cutoff, we're talking Bruno is perceived as all bad. So he embraces that part to keep peace and goes into hiding, which is also a semblance of constructivist paradigm. Alma too wants to maintain that image of perfection that's impossible to confer to. So she's always in survival mode. Any threat to that is like a Mirabel and Bruno situation. So she emotionally cuts them off within the spatial and emotional distance, like avoiding the stressful topics. And more or less, this is like systemic reactivity. Um, so like with that enmeshment and emotional fusion by maintaining that disillusioned illusion that Mirabel comes to find out. So, excuse me, for psychodynamic terms, it's about transference and countertransference as coping and defense mechanisms to prevent the anxiety caused by the unresolved trauma. And Abuela has suppressed this trauma throughout until everything falls apart, the house literally, and Mirabel confronting her about how nobody's happy. So prior to it was like upholding again impossible standards like perfection, causing this through projection, through burdens, through Julieta, through Isabella, and the fears of failure and imposter syndrome, Mirabel. So with trauma and how it unfolds, we can use structural family therapy to really incorporate that understanding and empathy as a conduit to help break that cycle. especially with Alma in that hierarchical state, and to really restructure unhealthy boundaries. So it's also representative culturally because Minuchin, who developed this, really um, had an ethnic background, and it shows how the family really shapes individuals. In this case, familismo, which is family loyalty and interconnectedness to provide more balance. So here's the treatment plan so far. SMART goals and objectives, just to kind of briefly go over those. They're going to be achieved within a duration of 3 months, checked back in on progress within 6 months. So honest and open communication through family dinner 2 times a week, outlining those boundaries, I statements, self-reflection, personal limits, what makes one uncomfortable, the value of feedback and diverse perspectives. Then family addressing intergenerational issues, visiting Pedro's gravesite once monthly. That incorporates that grieving process, but also instills that balance piece and bonding and positive relationships, committing to cultural values through altars and just healing, just really healing. And lastly, we have the incorporation of self-awareness, regulation emotionally, boundary setting, practices biweekly to achieve differentiation of self. So journaling to know those patterns and interactions, mindfulness through practicing body scans, box breathing, stress, self-care to reduce stress, implementing and practicing saying no in the mirror. And then these interventions are detriangulation strategies. So we're looking at Bowen family systems again. Kind of like this is like narrative therapy with like subjectivity, so like their interpretation of the event, the actual event, and then how it affects. So it's very liberating to explore their emotions on that. And then all of it overlaps into 3 E's of trauma. We could say like what they mentioned before with their subjectivity, reality, etc. And it's a proposed reality, which is a tenet of structural family therapy. So there has been proposals to improve the communication and identify any other triangulation issues. So how thoughts really influence actions and actions influence thoughts and vice versa. On this one, reducing emotional reactivity, think of writing a hostile letter you never want to send, that kind of stuff. Um, we want to focus instead of people pleasing, walking on eggshells, trying to instill healthy attachment. Also incorporate the family resilience model of adaptability to stressors by respecting individual differences when it comes to interests, emotions, communication, etc. So just that routine, also establishing association that I mentioned earlier, free association. Um, Processing through repetition will help with that trauma and defense mechanisms like scapegoating. And then differentiation of self, self-reflection, once again, practicing no, reflecting that autonomy, reinforcing autonomy, lessening that external validation, and empowering one's sense of self while also maintaining personal and interpersonal relationships. So the evaluation, we could be seen with communication strategies and how role plays overall go. These questionnaires I've listed are designed to note areas of weak points and improvement areas. The reports could be checked in twice monthly with the family and the dynamics there. And so what we've seen so far is they've definitely had more empathy and relief of that tension, and the family talks about the stress coming off in waves. And then this one, addressing generational trauma, we're really looking at addressing that in scales meant for monitoring symptoms, like the psychometric one, and then the mood log, which, can be brought to each session and debriefing to make sure, we're getting all those questions answered, processing effectively. And then kind of noticing them perking up about church again, less fidgeting from Mirabel, almost less pressured speaking, just like them getting excited about looking forward to activities. And that's really helpful. And I admired their bravery in that aspect. So they're moving into differentiation. And lastly, for evaluation, incorporation of self-awareness and authenticity. So looking at, okay, the we versus problem instead of you versus me, family feedback with client feedback and less fighting and situational scales to measure that, subjective data. So really like Alma took accountability here and she apologized for not realizing how much pressure she's put on everyone and how it's unraveled the whole family system and being more mindful of the stress and how to ground herself before getting all frustrated at others and like occupying time otherwise through church previously mentioned in those activities. Also, Mirabel taking an art class, Alma crocheting. So, as an oversight, progression is likened to the family resilience model to strengthen the unit by adaptability, using resources, functioning positively, and more strong. And we will continue looking at markers to indicate this and how the family and its members and the ecosystem are faring. So today we've discussed the case overview, presenting problems with individual history, their signs and symptoms, therapy theories and techniques, a model, a treatment plan, SMART goals with objectives, interventions, and the evaluation. And I want to leave you with this quote to look at just a little bit, or leave you with it just to keep in your mind.